Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our next section in our study of quadratics. This is going to be looking at quadratic equations. So this will be learning how to solve for x by factoring what we did in the last lesson and also using what's called extracting square roots. And as complicated as that sounds, it's actually the easier version if the problem looks a very certain way. So we're going to look first at how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring. And we're going to look first at this problem. This is a quadratic equation because there is an equal sign. In the last lesson, we were looking at just simple expressions. There were no equal signs. It was just write the problem in factored form. So here we have an equation. We need to solve for x. And here's what you must do every time. So we're going to put the equation in standard form. So let's do that first. Putting it in standard form means getting everything on one side and setting it equal to 0. If you recall, standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And that should be somewhere in your memory banks from the vocabulary that we did before. All right, so we need to subtract 18 from both sides of the equal sign. And by subtracting 18, we get a new equation that says, or not a new equation, but a new looking equation, x squared plus 7x minus 18 equals 0. Now that we have that, it's in standard form, and now we can factor the quadratic. I need two numbers that will multiply together to get negative 18, but will add together to get positive 7. If it's a negative here, that means I need a negative number and a positive number, and I need more positives. So I know that 9 times 2 make 18, and if I said a 9 and a negative 2 will make a positive 7. So I can factor x plus 9 and x minus 2. So using all of our skills that we learned in the last lesson, we can use that to factor this problem. Once we have factored it, we're going to use the zero product property. And the zero product property states if I have two things multiplied together to equal 0, that means one of them has to equal 0 or the other one equals 0. And what we do here is we say, okay, well, that means that x plus 9 equals 0. And it means that x minus 2 is equal to 0. And then we solve from there. So we solve using the zero product property. We make this statement that either of these factors could be 0. We minus 9 from both sides, and we get x is equal to negative 9. And here we get, when we add 2 to both sides, x is equal to 2. And there we have our two answers to our quadratic equation. A quadratic equation should always get two answers. Sometimes it's repeated. You'll see that a little bit later, I think. But we get two answers to these quadratic equations. All right, so that being said, let's try another example. Oops. So let's try this again. Let's put this in standard form. So let's subtract 6 from both sides, and we get a 2x squared plus 4x minus 6 equals 0. Then we need to factor. Well, here's something that I do know, that there is a GCF here, so I could factor out a 2 to make my life a little bit easier. By factoring out a 2, I get x squared plus 2x minus 3 is now equal to 0. And now I can factor the inside piece here, the quadratic. So I am looking for two numbers to multiply together to get -3 that will add together to get +2. And I know that -3 is equal to a 3 times a 1. In order to get a +2, I need more positive than I have negative. So I need a +3 and a -1. So I factor it to x plus 3 and x minus 1. After I have factored, we use the zero product property. Says that x plus 3 is equal to 0, and also says that x minus 1 is equal to 0. We could subtract 3 and we get x equals -3, and we add 1 and we get x is equal to 1. And there we go. That is that problem. So let's take a look. And notice that that 2, once we factored out the 2, it didn't really play any effect in the rest of the problem. We have 16x squared equals 8x. So again, we need to put it in standard form. So we need to minus 8x from both sides. These are not like terms, so I cannot combine them. So I get 16x squared minus 8x is equal to 0. Then I notice this type is kind of a different type here, but I notice that they have a GCF. They both have an 8 in them, and they both have an x. And when I factor out 8x, I'm left with a 2x minus 1. Remember, when I take an 8x out of 8x, it's a 1, because I have to be able to multiply this back in to get the original equation. All right, now we have two things multiplied together to be 0, so we can use the zero product property that says that 8x is equal to 0, that first piece, and it says that 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. So here, if I divide both sides by 8, I get x is 0. Here, if I add 1, I get 2x is equal to 1. And if I divide by 2, I get x equals 1/2. And there's our two answers. And remember, x equals 0 is a legitimate answer. It's not that there's nothing, but it's the actual number 0. All right, so that's the type of factoring. Let's look at what it looks like to extract square roots. This is for problems that look like this, where there is no linear term in the quadratic equation. So we have ax squared equals c, or if we have ax squared plus or minus c is equal to 0. Right? In this case, we have the second version. We have 5x squared minus 180 is equal to 0. So here's the how-to. First, you want to get x squared by itself. So we're going to add 180 to both sides, and we get 5x squared is equal to positive 180. X squared is not by itself yet because we have to divide by 5. So we get x squared is equal to 36. Now, some of you might see where we're going here. Once we get x squared by itself, we square root both sides of the equal sign. So we square root and square root. And when we square root, we get both positive and negative answers. When we square root x squared, we get x. And when we square root 36, we get 6. But we also get -6, because if you squared 6, you get 36. And if you square -6, you also get positive 36. And that is it. So this is kind of the easy type, but this is only for a specific type with no linear term. So make note of that. It's the only time you get x squared by itself in these cases. So we have 4x squared minus 25 for our next example. We need to get x squared by itself, so we're going to add 25 to both sides. Then we're going to divide by 4. And now that we have x squared by itself, we are going to take the square root of both sides, and we're going to get x is equal to, here we can do, instead of writing both separately, we can say plus or minus. That gives us both answers. And when we square root a fraction, we square root the top and the bottom separately. The square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 4 is 2, and there we have the two answers to this problem. All right, I think this is the last one here. We need to get x squared by itself. So we're going to divide both sides by 3. And we get x squared is equal to 24 over 3 is 8. We're going to square root both sides. And when I get square root of 8, I get plus or minus the square root of 8. And we don't want to really plug this as a decimal into our calculator. What we want to do is we want to remember how to simplify a square root. A square root can be simplified if you know a square number inside of 8. So I know that 8 is really 4 times 2. So I can rewrite the square root of 8 as the square root of 4 times 2. And I can split the square root. This becomes the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 4 is 2. So we get 2 times the square root of 2. So that's going to be our answer, our final answer. So we get x is equal to plus or minus 2 radicals of 2. Oops. All right, there we have some pretty good examples, I feel, for today's lesson. I am going to leave you with this. And once again, I hope you learned a little bit of things today on how to solve quadratic equations. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later.